Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the part one of the of this lecture, we have discussed about the exceptions. No, we were discussing about the several types of the exceptions, in which more precisely our concern was related to the runtime exceptions. As you already know and explained earlier in the first part of this lecture, that runtime exceptions are those exceptions which are generally executed while your application is running. They are more precisely they are related to your code, and any situation, unwanted situation that occurs in your code is actually basically throws an exception during the runtime. For example, the examples can be a null pointer exception. For example, you have used any object and that has not been initialized earlier, and you are actually trying to access the data of that object, then of course the null pointer exception will be raised. So these are the situations that may occur during your runtime of the program. Right. The runtime exception is caused by the programming errors such as bad casting. You are actually storing such kind of data that their data type mismatches. Such kind of exceptions are also raised during the runtime, accessing and out of bound arrays. You have actually limited the size of an array, and you're trying to access such kind of the index of an array that is actually has not been allocated a memory in the RAM. So that can be another situation, and there can be few numeric errors as well. So these are the runtime errors that may actually come across, and we call them runtime exceptions. So you need to handle them. Uh, we categorize exceptions into two main parts. One of them is the checked exceptions, and another one is the unchecked exceptions. Checked exceptions are those exceptions which are actually, if you translate the word checked, that means they must be checked by the compiler. And unchecked exceptions are those which are not basically checked by the compiler, and you need to handle those situations. Uh, Let me clarify that it's the programmer or the user, not the user. It's the programmer, the one who actually handles both type of these exceptions. Either they are checked exceptions or the unchecked exceptions. Unchecked exceptions are those exceptions which can be related to your program, and checked exceptions are those exceptions which are related to the compiler and to the system. So they are dealt by the compiler, and but you handle them explicitly. And the unchecked, basically there can be some logical errors, and if some such situation occurs, so you need to handle it. So they are called unchecked. I'll explain it in more detail. Runtime exceptions, errors, and their subclasses are known as the unchecked exceptions. So all those exceptions which are raised during the runtime, or there are a few errors, regardless they are system errors. So we call them the unchecked exceptions. For example, array out of bound and any other thing. So we call them the unchecked exceptions because they remain unchecked, and you need to handle them by yourself. All other exceptions are the checked exceptions. If you go to the, you have seen in the previous slide, I have detailed a tree of all exceptions where you can see uh, these exceptions. They are related to or they come under the category of the unchecked exceptions, and the rest of them, they are the checked exceptions, meaning that the compiler forces the programmer to check and deal with the exceptions. These are the unchecked exceptions. It's the programmer who need to deal such kind of situations. Uh, Unchecked exceptions, in most cases, exceptions reflect programming logic errors that are not recoverable. So it's related to your logic or the algorithm which you are actually writing, or the coding. So you will have to deal with those situations. So that's why they are called the unchecked exceptions, because they are not related to the compiler. all those things that are related to the compiler, you need to deal with them. For example, a null pointer exception is thrown if you access an object through a reference variable before an object is assigned to it. So as I have already explained, there can be a situation you have declared an object and you have not assigned any data to that object. So that object will be containing a null value. So whenever you try to access the value of that object, and so automatically the null pointer exception is thrown. So you need to handle this situation. If you don't need handle it, your application basically stops working. uh, or you will have to deal with it in your code. And out of bound exceptions is thrown if you access an element in an array outside the bound of the array. There can be another situation, for example, the user, if you are giving a choice to a user to input in any specific array location or the index. So if he or she specifies such index that does not exist in your array, or it has not been allocated a memory, so automatically the anti-index out of bound exception is thrown. So these are called or covered under the unchecked exceptions, so you will have to deal with these situations. More about unchecked exceptions: there are logic errors that should be corrected in the program. Unchecked exceptions can occur anywhere in the program. Okay, they can occur in anywhere. Wherever there is a situation, you need to deal with those errors. As you can see, those highlighted areas are representing the unchecked exception, and the rest of the which are not actually highlighted, they are called the checked exceptions. uh, in the main category which covers under the unchecked exceptions are the runtime exceptions and all of the errors. Okay, once exception is occurred, so how to deal with it? Now that is important thing. You will have to actually deal with those exceptions. uh, there are three stages for the exceptions. First, you will have to declare the exception, then you throw the exception, and then you cache the exception. Declaring exception means that you will have to specify those situations where your exception may occur, right? So you need to declare it. Then if the exception occurs, you will have to throw it. Throwing basically comes under two parts. One is explicitly you throw the exception, and another one is automatically thrown by the compiler. So we'll discuss in more detail through these two examples. And the third one is the catching one. It is common. Whenever exception is thrown either explicitly by the compiler or the explicitly by the programmer or the compiler, so in both cases you will have to cache that exception. In the catching part, I have already explained in my previous part 1 of this lecture, in which you actually catch the exception and you deal with that situation, what should be there. Okay, there are two different ways through which you can define the exception, or you can declare the exception. And the first one, as you can see, we have a method 1. You put all things in a try catch block. So if, for example, there is a method 2 that may invoke an exception, you will have to put it in the try block, and another one is in the catch block. This method 2 is declared like this. For example, the method 2 can invoke the exception. So in that case, as you can see, we have actually detailed a throws exception. If an error occurs, throws a new exception. So that means you are actually defining a class for the exception, and you will have to throw the object of that exception. Whenever you will throw it, it will be automatically caught in the catch block here. So this is the situation through which you can define the exception. This is one of the methods. Another method, you can deal with both of them. In that situation, actually, you throw the explicitly, and you can also deal with this situation as well. Okay, declaring exception will go in more detail of the declaring and throwing and catching. Declaring exception, every method must state the type of checked exceptions it might throw. This is known as the declaring exception, right? Every method must state the type of checked exception it might throw. all checked exceptions that can occur. So you will have to deal with them. All those situations are called the declared exception. For example, the public void method throws IO exception, and public void my method throws IO exception and the other exception. If you have a chance that your method may throw more than or there can be more than one exception, so you can add them by using this comma. Okay, let me tell you, there are a lot of exceptions are there. Exceptions are basically the classes defined already by the Java. Uh, if you are not sure about the type of the exception that it may throw or it may raise the exception, uh, there are a few situations when you will compile, your compiler will automatically tell you that such kind of exception can occur. So it gets easy for you to determine that this exception need to be dealt. So you can put the type of exception, exception class here. If you are not sure about any of the exception or you have more than one exceptions, then you can uh, only write the exception word. Exception is basically also a class defined in Java. So in that case, if you define only the exception, this is the IO exception. It is explicitly specifying that there can be the input output exception can be there. So if you're not sure about if there is a IO exception or any other array out of bound exception, so you just put the exception word. Exception is basically a class built in, defined in the Java. While handling the exception in the cache block, you can get the type of exception from the thrown object. That you can do it with the object name, for example, ex dot, and you can get the type of the exception. So it will be easy for you to handle a lot of exceptions if you come across this situation. But this is the procedure through which you can declare the exception. Throwing exception, this other part, when the program detects an error, the program can create an instance of the appropriate exception type. As you can see, the exception is basically a class. So an instance of that class is created whenever exception occurs. And then you need to throw that object. So that becomes the throwing the exception. Actually, you are throwing the object of that exception. For example, throw new the exception. For example, you have declared a new type of the exception with the name the exception. It's not a built-in exception. For example, you have actually created your own exception class. So in that case, as you can see, whenever you use the new keyword with the name of the class and these round brackets, that means an instance will be created with this thing. You already know it. So actually throwing, it is throwing the object of this class, right? So new keyword creates the object of this particular class. So that object is basically thrown. Another way you can create the object of class exception class like this. The exception ex is equal to new of the exception. As you can see, this ex has been created, and now you can throw it. So these both are different ways through which you can actually throw the object. In both cases, the object is thrown. Okay. There is an example of throwing the exception. For example, you have a set radius method, and in which that throws the illegal argument exception. For example, there is an argument that has been accepted by the user, and you want to verify that whether this radius provided by the user or into the method, either it is uh, following the prescribed range or not. For example, it should be greater than 0. So if it is greater than 0, that means it's fine. Another case, if the radius is lesser than 0, then you will have to handle this situation. In that case, you're throwing the object of this exception with that argument. Radius cannot be negative. As you can see, this is the explicit class that has been defined by the programmer, and it is accepting one argument. So that means you are calling the constructor with this argument. So the new creating the class, and that object is basically thrown. So you will have to catch that exception. How you can catch that exception? that is actually done through the catch block. As you can see, if you have more than one exception types, for example, this one is the IO exception, this is array out of bound exception, so each will be having its own object. So whenever you will throw the object, it will be caught right here, but it will, it's like uh, method calling. So whenever you call a method from some point, so the method, if you are sending some arguments, it automatically comes where that method has been declared. It's time like this. So in the cache block, wherever you will throw the exception, it will come into the cache block. And actually the object that is thrown will be handled here. It will be actually saved here. The object will be copied in that object. So it's important that you define the type of object. It should be same. For example, you are throwing the IO exception. So right here, it should be the IO exception object as well, which will be handling that exception. Otherwise, there will be a type mismatch and you will get an error. So right in the cache block, you are handling the exception where whatever you want to do, you can do the right appropriate code here. For example, there are more than one exceptions. For example, there is an IO exception is also thrown, array out of bound exception is also thrown. So you need to put them in a one try block, right? So if there are more than one exceptions, like the IO exception, you need to handle them in the different cache blocks. IO exception will be called right here, and array out of bound exception will be called here, and similarly for the rest of the exceptions. So this is important to note that there's only one try block and there can be more than one cache block. So as I said earlier, if you have more than one exception to be thrown, so you just throw the type of exception as the exception class, and you can determine in a one cache block, and you can define through the if statements, you can determine the type of exception which is thrown, and you can deal with them appropriately within the one cache block. So you need not to define more than one cache blocks. Okay. Catch or declared checked exceptions. Checked exceptions, Java forces you to deal with the checked exception. If a method declares a checked exception, that is an exception other than the error in the runtime. As we have already discussed that only the error and the runtime exceptions are the unchecked exceptions. So rest of all are the checked exceptions. So again, you need to handle this situation as well. Regardless they are checked or the unchecked, you will have to deal in the try catch block. Rest of procedure is same. For example, there is an IO exception or there can be few other situations. You need to handle them like this. Okay, a few words about the finally clause. It also comes, it's an other block that comes under the cache block. Finally block is a kind of block, regardless if the statement, the exception is thrown or not, this finally block will always be included. So let's discuss an example of this situation. Suppose exception in the statement. For example, you have put some statement here or statements in the try block, and those statements may generate an exception. So what will happen if exception is thrown, if there is no exception, then the finally block will be executed. Because no exception is thrown, the cache block is not executed, then it will directly come to the finally block. For example, then the next statement is executed. For example, there are more than one statements, and the second statement, suppose an exception of the type exception 1 is thrown in statement 1. No type is the exception 1 is thrown. So in that case, it should be caught here. It will come here, as you can see. When exception is thrown, it will be dealt by the appropriate cache block. This is the exception 1, and again the finally block will be executed. Finally block will always be executed regardless exception is thrown or not, because there can be few situations in which you will have to always show some message or some processing that need to be performed regardless exception is thrown or not. Then you need to put it in the finally block. And then the rest part of the program will be executed. Statement through throws an exception of type exception 2. For example, in that situation, again, it will be handled by the other type of the exception, because statement 2 is throwing the exception 2 object, so it will be dealt in the in the cache block which is dealing with the exception 2. No, it will handle, and then again there comes a finally block. As you can see, you are handling. After handling, it comes to the finally block, but this part is remained that needs to be executed. Then it will rethrow the exception to control transfer. So if, for example, if you want to throw another exception of the same exception, again it can be thrown, but right after this one, if you handle it, the finally block will be executed, then it can be rethrown. Okay, that's all with this lecture. Thank you very much.